So if I want to make a call out from my SIP phone in my private network to a buddy out on the public telephone network, maybe a non-SIP user, then perhaps I could use a PSTN SS7 gateway that translates between SIP signaling internally and SS7 signaling externally, and a media gateway that translates between different media formats. As I dial a telephone number at the IP or domain of the PSTN gateway, well, it's the host part of that URI that routes the invite to the gateway, where the telephone number from the user part of the SIP URI is then used to populate the SS7 invite equivalent, the IAM message. The IAM is sent off through the PSTN network to the phone, causing it to ring. On pickup, the SS7 ACM message comes back to the gateway, where the equivalent SIP response is created and sent upstream to the SIP phone. It's the host part of the URI that routes the request to the PSTN gateway, the signaling gateway, and it's the username part that's used by the gateway for routing the SS7 IAM. Now, it's more likely in a private network that the user's default outbound proxy, perhaps an IPPBX or something, will be in the path, and that the user just dials the number, leaving the phone to add the SIP prefix and an enterprise domain. Arriving at the IPPBX, the dialed number will then be matched against the IPPBX's dial plan rules, resulting, we hope, in a match and an address for a downstream entity that can handle this call. In this case, the signaling gateway. Remember, the signaling gateway just translates the signaling to set up and manage the call. It doesn't handle or process any media. You see, IP networks and circuit switched networks handle media differently. In fact, they'll often use different, perhaps incompatible codecs to encode and decode the audio. So, how do we fix this media incompatibility? With a media gateway, typically sitting alongside the signaling gateway as part of the PSTN interop solution. We'll often see them combined in one physical device, acting as both signaling gateway and media gateway. Well, either way, the media gateway transcodes media, receiving perhaps G729 media packets on the SIP side, translating and sending the equivalent G711 media on the PSTN side. Now, there are 2 points I'd like to discuss as we look a little deeper into the call flow. There's not always a one-to-one mapping between SIP and SS7, both signaling messages themselves and the content within those messages. And the signaling on both sides needs to enable media exchange by routing or pointing the media streams to the media gateway. Okay, first then, the invite from the SIP caller is received at the signaling gateway. As normal, its SDP media options contain a list of the codecs the user agent's willing to use and the IP address and port on which it's expecting to receive media packets. The signaling gateway is actually now the SIP endpoint user agent server, as far as the SIP call is concerned. Accordingly, we expect it to create and send a 100 trying, just to confirm reliable delivery of the invite. But before initiating things on the PSTN side, the signaling gateway calls out to one or more media gateways. A, to find one with sufficient resources to transcode this call. B, perhaps to reserve those resources. And C, to get media gateway details needed on the PSTN side to set up the media path to that media gateway. Now, different implementations use different control protocols for this signaling gateway, media gateway interaction. Next, having selected a media gateway and having its details, the signaling gateway creates an SS7 initial address message, an IAM message, SS7's equivalent of the invite, sending it downstream through the PRI, we'll talk about PRIs in a moment, to the PSTN network, including in it details of the media gateway for subsequent routing of the media stream. Now, there's probably a host of PSTN switches and routers through which the IAM request passes on its way downstream to the phone. Now, once received, as well as sounding its ringing tone, the phone creates and returns an address complete message, or ACM. At this point, the media path over the specific PSTN trunks is now determined, and this will feel foreign to us SIP folks, a one-way media path is established between the two PSTN endpoints, from callee back to caller. Caller in this case not being the user agent client, not even the signaling gateway, but of course the media gateway. Now, as a SIP guy, I wouldn't expect an audio media stream until both parties exchange the 200 OK and the ACK. But in the PSTN world, the audio begins after the ACM. It's through this one-way audio channel that the callee plays ringing tones back to the caller, and through which it might play announcement messages. So at this point, the ringing tones are played not to the SIP user agent client. There's no audio channel on the SIP side yet, but to the media gateway. Ironic, really, as the ringtone media is simply absorbed by the media gateway. It's not passed upstream, not actually heard by any human. Meanwhile, the signaling gateway, oblivious to ringtones sent to the media gateway, translates the ACM to its SIP equivalent, the 180 ringing, and passes it upstream to the SIP user agent client. Then, at that point, the user agent client can with confidence play its ringing audio file back to the caller, indicating that the downstream phone is indeed ringing. Now, note also how there's no equivalent SS7 100 trying. Now, that's because the PSTN is so reliable that it doesn't need reliable delivery checks. Then, when the callee picks up, an answer message, an ANM, is returned, which in turn propagates a SIP 200 OK from the gateway to the caller. Note how the contact address in the 200 is the address of the signaling gateway, while the SDP connection header contains the IP address not of itself, but of the media gateway. Information, of course, gleaned earlier during that initial signaling gateway-media gateway interaction. We see the IP address and the port through which the media gateway expects to receive media packets. Following receipt of the 200 OK, the caller returns the ACK just to confirm to the signaling gateway that it's received the final response to the invite. Note how, again, because the PSTN is so reliable, there's no need for an ACK equivalent on the PSTN side. At the same time as receiving the ANM, the PSTN audio channel becomes two-way, and after the 200 ACK exchange on the SIP side, the media gateway begins transcoding two-way audio. Finally then, a caller hang-up triggers a SIP buy, responded to immediately by the signaling gateway with a 200 OK to indicate reliable delivery of the buy and to formally conclude the SIP part of the call, followed directly with an SS7 release message, or REL, which in turn triggers a release complete message, or RLC, to formally conclude the PSTN side of the call. Call initiation the other way is similar, just with the direction and sequence of messages a little different. This time, when the PSTN caller dials, the SS7 IAM is routed through the PSTN network, through the PRI, to the signaling gateway, acting now as a PSTN endpoint. Before initiating things on the SIP side, again, the signaling gateway arranges a media gateway resource before creating and sending a SIP invite. Note how it's provided details of the media gateway in the connection address in the audio port, and how it's included its own address in the contact header. Now the callee SIP user agent knows to send media packets to the media gateway and subsequent signaling packets to the signaling gateway. Receiving the invite, as expected, the user agent server returns a 100 trying just to confirm reliable delivery of the invite, and immediately a 180 ringing, reporting the phone is now ringing. Note how, although the SIP phone is playing a ringing sound, no media is established between the phone and the media gateway, not even a one-way media path. That's a PSTN concept, not a SIP concept. In fact, receiving the 180, acting now in PSTN mode, the signaling gateway creates and returns the address complete message, the ACM, the signal in the PSTN world that the dial phone is ringing. Now, at this point, the one-way audio path is established between the PSTN endpoints, over which ringing tones are played from the media gateway back to the caller. Then, when the SIP callee picks up, a 200 OK is sent from caller to gateway. Note how the SDP in the 200 and the contact address point, as we'd expect, to the called SIP user agent, effectively telling the gateways downstream where to send back media and subsequent requests. That done, two things happen, not necessarily in this order. An ACK is sent back to confirm reliable delivery of the final response to the invite, and an answer message is sent containing media details, not of the SIP user agent, but the media gateway. Here now the PSTN audio channel becomes two-way, and the media gateway begins transcoding between PSTN media on one side and IP media on the other. Finally, if the caller hangs up, an SS7 release message, REL, is sent, triggering a release complete message in return, formally concluding the PSTN side of the call, and a SIP buy request on the other, responded by a 200 OK to the buy to formally conclude the SIP side of the call. Finally, beware that there's not always a direct equivalent between SS7 message content and SIP message content. For example, the display name in the to header, well, it has no PSTN equivalent. Neither is there any notion in the PSTN world of subject or priority, organization or expires. Now, none of these are particular showstoppers for basic calls, but they could be a problem if there's advanced SIP services that are depending on them. Now, the focus of this whole lesson has been on enabling interop between SIP and the public telephone network, how to translate between SIP and PSTN signaling. The irony, as discussed previously, is that nowadays most public telephone networks have swapped out the PSTN signaling from the core and have replaced it with SIP and IP networks. They've moved core routing from circuit switching over to IP. Remember, the public telephone network is not the public switched telephone network. The public telephone network is the combined offering of all of the world's regular telephone providers. The PSTN is a legacy subset of the public telephone network. So when using a PSTN gateway, it's very likely that SIP will be converted to SS7 just to enter the public telephone network. But because it uses SIP for core routing, will be converted back to SIP for core network traversal. Only if the called party is a regular PSTN user will the SIP be converted to SS7 for routing over the last mile. It begs the question, why? Why bother converting SIP just to enter the public network when the network uses SIP anyway? Can't we find a way to exchange SIP directly? Of course we can, and it's through the SIP trunk that we do so, something we'll discuss in the next lesson. So, in summary then, the PSTN gateway enables calls between the SIP world and the public switched telephone network world. A PSTN gateway comprises two parts: the signaling gateway that translates between SIP and SS7, and the media gateway that transcodes between different media formats. In some implementations, the signaling gateway and the media gateway might be functions of one physical entity. There's a workable equivalence between SIP and SS7. The invite maps to the initial address message, the 180 ringing to the address complete message, the 200 to the invite maps to the answer message, the buy to the release message, and the 200 OK to the buy to the release complete message. But there's no mapping for some SIP messages, including the 100 trying or the ACK. Remember, the signaling gateway manipulates the SDP to make sure both SIP party and PSTN party send their media not to the signaling gateway, but to the media gateway by inserting the media gateway's address and port in the connection SDP header and in the IAM equivalent. It also inserts its own address in the contact header, so the SIP client will route subsequent requests back to the signaling gateway. Regarding audio, there's a two-stage setup. One-way media is established from the PSTN caller back to the PSTN callee after the ACM, but before the ANM. Two-way media is only established between the two PSTN parties after the ANM, media that's at the same time then transcoded by the media gateway and streamed between the two SIP parties. Okay, that's a summary of the PSTN gateway, but remember, the public telephone network is no longer synonymous with the public switched telephone network. In fact, most public telephone networks use SIP for their core routing instead of SS7. So why use a gateway to translate SIP to SS7? only to be translated back to SIP? Precisely, no good reason. The better way is to use a SIP trunk, something we'll discuss in the next lesson.